Hi everyone, welcome back to Entre-Elles. I'm your host, Tombeni Kouloufoua, and first a quick reminder, if you like Entre-Elles, make sure to subscribe and leave a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast if that's where you listen to this episode. You can also follow Entre-Elles on social media, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, or DM me to tell me what you like about the podcast or what I could do better. Now, let's dive into episode 23. Today's guest is an incredibly accomplished woman. Lucy Baldwin is the Global Head of Research and Equity Advisory at Citi. She's had a stellar career in banking. A managing director at 27, she's worked for some of the most prestigious investment banks in the world at a very senior level. I was absolutely thrilled when she accepted my invitation to come on Entre-Elles, not only to share her experience in banking, but also to discuss her views on the ways to boost growth confidence, the importance for institutions to nurture their diverse talents, her approach to mentoring, the importance of work-life balance, and much more. This is our conversation recorded in London. Hi, Lucy. Welcome to Entre-Elles. It is such a joy and an honor to have you on. I know you're extremely busy and it was a difficult one to squeeze in. So let's get started. As you know, in this podcast, I interview women all around the world. And I always ask the same question. Where were you born and where did you grow up?
Oh, lovely. Thank you. No, great to be here. Thanks for inviting me and having me on. So I grew up in a little place called Church Stretton in Shropshire. So for those of you with good geography of the UK, it's somewhere between Birmingham and Wales. It's very beautiful, lots of hills, lots of sheep, very rural, very tranquil. And so I grew up there with my mum, my dad, and my brother.
And growing up, did you have a clear idea of what you wanted to do later in life? I've had guests on the podcast who told me that there was a triggering event, something that really made them want to join a specific industry. I know that Tracy Watkinson, who I had on, I think it was in episode 14, mentioned that for her, it was the movie Wall Street. Was there such a thing, such a clear marker for you?
Well, I suppose there was in some ways. I mean, when I was very young, I wanted to be a vet, actually, was what I really wanted to do. And then I think I probably realised I wasn't that well cut out for it. I think I'd have taken home a lot of the sort of pain and suffering and the worries. So, you know, I knew it probably wasn't going to be right for me, even though obviously you do a lot of good in that job as well. And there's lots of happy stories too. I think when I realised that finance was for me, was probably at university. I'd seen my dad sort of nudging my brother into finance because I think for my dad, who'd kind of grown up, you know, in Wales, in a pretty sort of low income family, quite a complicated childhood, and he'd not been able to sort of do that. He hadn't been able to finish his education or sort of pursue his dream, which when he was younger was to be an accountant. And so he'd ended up, you know, working his way up through factory life, as it were, and looking after a factory in Shropshire. And so although he did very well from where he started, I think he was always a little frustrated that he didn't get the chance to kind of pursue his finance dreams. And so he tried to sell those dreams, I think, to my brother, who was pretty uninterested and wanted to do other kind of creative things. But I thought, oh, yeah, maybe that could work for me, because I can remember listening into the conversations. And so when I was then at university, it was actually my university boyfriend that sort of nudged me into moving to London, which I was a little apprehensive about, to be honest, at first. And he said, look, you know, you should think about finance. You should think about an investment bank. And so I applied to some grad schemes there. But I suppose the single thing that tipped me over, that's similar to the story you were recounting, was I read Barbarians at the Gate as part of my degree and as part of a bit of coursework that I was doing. And I can remember reading that thinking, wow, this is all super exciting, kind of, you know, big LBOs, takeover stuff. Maybe that's what I should do. So when I actually first started at a place called Cazenove, and again, it was all a bit serendipitous really when I look back, you know, part of that interview process at Cazenove was very fortuitous because I met a lady there through the assessment centre process who, you know, had a connection to this tiny little town in Shropshire that I grew up in. And so we sort of bonded and everything just felt right. It was quite weird, really, I suppose, when you look back. And so when I started there, I thought that what I really wanted to do was corporate finance and M&A. Although, to be honest, within the first few months, I realised that probably wasn't going to be for me long term, which I guess was a little disappointing at the start.
It's really interesting what you're saying, because it does show how broad this industry is, because many times you start with something or you have this sort of image of wanting to do this, and then you end up working on something different. I guess that's also the beauty of the banking industry. Did you ever feel that at any point during your childhood, primary school, secondary school, that confidence was something that you had to work on? There's a book called The Confidence Code for Girls by Katie Kay and Claire Shipman. And in that book, they mentioned that by age 14, boys' confidence levels are 27% higher than girls. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I think as a child, as a very young child, exactly to your point, I was probably quite confident. I was probably quite outspoken and brave. And I suppose it's often only as you get a little bit older and maybe more self-aware, and you hear what people say and you think, oh, actually, maybe I'm too loud. Maybe I should be a bit quieter. And certainly by the time I was into my teens, I was, you're obviously, I guess, in many ways, like your typical teenager, wrestling with that kind of imposter syndrome. Am I good enough to do this? Am I good enough to be here? Should I go to that university? Should I do these subjects for A level or whatever it might be? I think, my experience around confidence is, as a sort of general rule, it certainly helped me to become a relative expert in a small, narrow area early on in my career, and I think part of the reason I ended up starting, properly in research. So as I mentioned, I had this kind of brief dalliance in corporate finance right at the beginning, which is what I thought I wanted to do. And then, to your point, it's that realization that actually maybe this isn't everything it's cracked up to be, or it's not perhaps what I thought it was. And then I sort of fell in love with something that I didn't even really know existed at the time, which is this concept of, for me, it was equity research. And so that's where I then started and sort of forged my path, as it were, and getting to be a relative expert in a very narrow space gave me then some confidence. And then once you have a little bit of success, it's that virtuous circle, isn't it? And it kind of breeds and sort of grows on itself, as it were. And so I think that for me certainly helped, because then once I knew I could crack one thing, you have the confidence that you can crack others. And so that worked really, really well in the early stages of my career. But again, these things are a little bit of a lottery. I was so fortunate that I worked with some amazing people early on that gave me a lot of that confidence, and that were, great mentors or sponsors. And, some of that will have obviously even been at school. I can remember falling in love with economics because I had an amazing A-level economics teacher, and she was super inspiring. I often wonder, had I not have had that particularly good teacher, would I have maybe then gone in another direction at university, and then, maybe a different path. So life is often full of these sort of twists and turns, I would say. And I guess to your earlier comment, right, sometimes when you're young, you're wrestling with the things that you think you should do and that maybe you need to do. Certainly for me, I was very focused on how do I pay back my student debt and how do I get on the property ladder and all of those things. And also me being a girl, I put some pressure on myself to sort of say, right, I need to get to this point at this stage so that then I can have the opportunity to have a family and, all these kinds of crazy things that, I think reading books like Sheryl Sandberg, Lean In, it sort of talks about, often us girls have a tendency to kind of plan too far ahead and sort of opt out of things before we've even given it a go. And I was certainly guilty of that. And I sort of recognize that now looking back. But I think, that confidence is so important. But ultimately, you have to, I think, figure out what it is that gives you confidence as an individual. And it's often quite a holistic range of things. But also I realized that for me, it was having the confidence to actually choose a career and a path that I really love. So even though I thought that the sensible and the right thing to do was this kind of investment banking, corporate M&A track, I pretty quickly realized that A, wasn't necessarily going to be right for me. It wasn't necessarily what I was going to be particularly good at. And it wasn't really something that I sort of fell in love with in the way that I sort of fell in love with some of the learning around, research and, again, a bit like falling in love with my subject at university. So it's that kind of mosaic picture, I guess, of what are you good at, what do you love, then the practicalities of what can you actually be paid for, what does the world need? And that gives you that kind of mishmash, I guess, of things that give you passion, things that become a mission or a vocation, and or your profession. I think there's a lot of people now that can help you identify, how do you create all of those things together and work through those things with you at younger stages. But I don't think careers advice was probably that holistic and broad when I was growing up.
You've talked before about the importance in banking in particular of being good at what you do, really. There's a quote that I want to mention from one of your interviews where you said, to become a leader in finance, you have to be a technical expert. You have to excel in your silo or in your sphere. Can you elaborate on that? And do you think that very early on you understood the rules of the game? And the reason I'm asking that is that there's a book that came out in France, I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago, from an ex-commodities trader. And she talked a lot about the fact that many women, smart, get to the industry and then struggle because they're used to being celebrated for their academic achievements. And it turns out that in the industry, beyond that, you do also have to promote yourself, sell yourself, understand how to navigate the firm itself. Beyond the expertise, do you think that also you understood that very early on?
Yeah, gosh, there's a few things there. I think that, the reason I gave that quote about needing to be a technical expert does in many ways come back a little to the confidence point, right? And I do think having that really solid foundation in something gives you the confidence, but it also gives others around you the opportunity to put confidence in you, because again, they can see that you've done something to a really high level, really high standard. And I think once you've then demonstrated that ideally in a couple of different places or a couple of different spheres, that then makes people go, do you know what, I'm going to take a chance on that person. I'm going to give them the stretch assignment or the kind of slightly random eclectic role that is a little less defined or whatever that may be. And certainly I felt that, once I'd kind of proven myself in a couple of different areas, it really helped me to take the leap into slightly more unknown, what might be perceived as more risky seats, risky roles. And so that, that was part of the basis for that. You need to be a technical expert. But I also think there's a truth and a reality, which is you tend to get promoted on your strengths. And so a lot of how I think many of the banks and the finance industry encourage managers and people to develop and to think is to really build on those areas that are your real strengths, right? And they're often typically also the things that you enjoy and you're pretty passionate about. That sort of natural, you're good at it, you put in more effort, the usual 10,000 hours of effort type of thing that makes you an expert. And then the better you get, the more focused you get on it, all of those sorts of things. So I think that's very true. And then there's a kind of concept that you want to try and obviously minimize any weaknesses or things that might stand in your way as an obstacle. But I do think that tends to hold quite broadly in most areas of life in terms of your ability to move forward. I also think to the question that you asked around, do I get the sort of rules of the game and rules of the road? I think they change. I think they evolve as well. And I think you have to sort of evolve with them, particularly things like leadership styles. We've seen a huge transformation, I would suggest, in, leadership styles and what people aspire to be and what people want from their leadership, certainly in the last 15 years or so. I think what we've all learned is that EQ is every bit as important as IQ. I mean, clearly, the way that you learn today is so different. I look back and we obviously learned by rote and memorized lots of dates. And that was the sort of whole process of how you would learn to cram for an exam, to pass a test, to get a result, to get you to the next level. And I do think that is obviously, thankfully, moving on, and it's much more about kind of critical thinking and your ability to apply, information knowledge to different areas and different situations. I think to go back to the concept of, is just being an amazing specialist enough? I think increasingly the answer to that is no. I think, there's a brilliant book, I believe it's by David Epstein, called Range, which is sort of how generalists triumph in a specialized world. And I think that ability to go, drop down into something at 3,000 feet, but then to zoom back out at 35,000 feet to put things into perspective is really, really important. And certainly reading a book like that kind of made me think about it and made me kind of question some of the things that I'd always sort of, I guess, held true from like economic theory around specialization and things.
You've touched on promotions. Investment banks are operated in a rather rigid and strict hierarchy where managing director is the highest corporate title. It's a highly coveted prize, and it's definitely a milestone in a banker's career, especially for a woman in a money-making role. You became managing director at 27 when you were at Goldman Sachs, which is incredibly young by all measures. What was that process like for you?
Yeah, again, like many things in life, there's an element of fortune and luck and right place, right time. And I certainly was really fortunate that, there was a period of time during which the sector that I was an analyst within and covering was massively in focus, massively, if you like, re-rating. And there was lots of client interest. It enabled me to build a brand as an analyst quite quickly. And I was really lucky as well that I think I'd had the opportunity to cover some different sectors, industrials before I did consumer and retail and luxury. And I'd also had some opportunities to cover some more defensive sectors like food retail within that. So my sort of grounding was quite thorough in that I'd learned from lots of really great people. And I suppose I tried to take little bits from lots of those different people and put them together. But I was also, I think, fairly well aware of my limitations. And so, one of my main techniques was trying to partner with other really smart analysts that were there and, co-author product and then go off joint marketing that. And that, hugely helped, I think, in terms of my ability to raise my profile. I also really just loved like building and growing a team. And I think one of the greatest privileges and honors was sort of being given that opportunity to, then kind of grow a team, I guess, almost in my mold, in the sense that, I'd, I guess, got a certain DNA about me in terms of how I like to approach the job and how I like to kind of talk about the sector, talk to clients, and then being able to go and hire other people that I thought could do the same was hugely fun. And we did that for a number of years, and it was probably professionally some of the most fun years I guess I've had. The MD process, I think, everywhere is always quite stressful for people because it's obviously lots of scrutiny, lots of focus. The first time that I was being considered and I didn't make it, I remember that being particularly tough and disappointing. And of course, how you handle that is such a big part of then that next phase of your career and how you bounce back and how you cope and how you adjust and what you change. And I think for me, although in the last 20 years, corporate leadership styles have obviously changed and evolved huge amounts, finding my own style and finding my own way and finding, that balance between it's not just what you do, but it's how you do it. And it's not just running a successful team. It's making sure it's a properly inclusive team where everybody's voice is heard and you build it in the right way and you take that time. There just are some things that you can't really rush, and I think although I always felt in the early stages of my career I was in a hurry to try and get things done and move on to the next thing, the reality is that some things just take a lot of hard work and a lot of time. And so, for me, going through that process of not getting promoted that first time gave me longer to really think about what kind of team I wanted to build, what kind of culture I wanted to foster. And I think actually the development then of that over the course of the next 12 months really helped and put me in good stead to then actually finally get over the line and get promoted, which, was was great and I hugely enjoyed. But I do think also as you kind of get older and you look back on life, you do realise that things that seem very, very important at a point in time and seemed very time critical really aren't, and careers and lives are, hopefully marathons, not sprints. And, my mum always says to me, you've got to stand back and smell the flowers, right? Enjoy the moment, celebrate the achievements, and really remember to pause and to do those things. And certainly things that I thought at the time were really, really big events in the context and perspective of more life and more time, you realise, yes, they're important and they're precious, but you have to put them into context, and actually whether you get it 1 year or 2 years later isn't such a big deal after all. My career, like most people's, it's never linear. There's lots of ups and downs, and I think during some of the downs I've definitely learned to keep things much more in perspective and to have more balance, right? I think someone said to me years ago, there are 4 quadrants to life, and one is your career, one is your family, one is your friends, and one is you personally. And the reality is you can only ever have 2 of the 4 humming at any one point in time. The other 2, almost by definition, will end up being in deficit. And so I think I've realized that at different points in time, my job had kind of taken over my life and was holding too much sway and too much importance. And I was starving some other very important things of the oxygen that were needed to keep them going. And so I definitely think now I'm probably much better at keeping those things in check.
So how would you describe your leadership style today, based on what you said, that it's evolved throughout your career?
Look, I think there's a lot of work that suggests that great leadership makes people feel safe, right? And I think that's, in today's world, more of a given than it probably was before. And so, I hope that I create an environment for teams where they feel safe and able to ask the silly question, to put forward the kind of crazy, out of the box, wacky idea without any kind of judgment. I think all of those things are really important. I'd like to think I'm pretty empathetic, as a leader, and I like to try and build a consensus. I would much rather the team come together, explore lots of options, build a consensus, and then, go out and face the world together with a united front once the decision's then made. I think probably in the early years, I used to worry that either it would take too long to get to the consensus and that would cost business opportunity, or that the building of the consensus would somehow dilute down the bold ideas or the kind of really high conviction stuff that gets your team noticed. But I've realized over the years that doesn't necessarily have to be the case if it's managed well, and actually getting people really comfortable and kind of co-creating those bold ideas together is much, much more powerful, because again, it goes back to that sense of safety and confidence that you're coming at it together as a team rather than an individual. So, I think those are probably the most key, I guess, characteristics I would say I try and draw on in terms of my style and how I like to work with the team.
You've credited great mentors earlier in our conversation for helping or guiding you when you needed it. You've probably been a mentor yourself. So in your view, what makes a good mentor? And is it important to have one in the industry you're building a career into?
Yeah, I think mentoring and sponsorship, which is obviously different, but has some parallels, they're really critical things, right? And certainly some of the best advice I got early was that concept of creating your own board of directors, right? Think about yourself as, like a company, and build yourself a board of really interesting perspectives. So not necessarily just the people that think like you and that you enjoy having a coffee and a conversation with. Pick the people that give you the tough feedback, that tell you the things that maybe slightly irritate you, but maybe that you need to hear. And you don't have to tell those people. Most people that have been my mentors don't necessarily know that they have been. And I think there's a charm in that and a naturalness. I don't think I'm trying to remember, but I don't think I've ever been sort of paired up with somebody officially as my mentor in a way that has then, lasted years and years. Most of the really long lasting relationships are the ones that have just happened very naturally. I think I've massively enjoyed being a mentor, and I'm a big believer in the sort of concept of reverse mentoring, right? You learn so much from people at different stages of life and career. And for example, I do a lot of mentoring with my old university, the University of Birmingham, and I get a huge amount of joy and satisfaction from seeing those young people leave university, go out into the world. Bizarrely, actually, I ended up working with somebody who had been my Birmingham University mentee many years before. And it was just wonderful seeing him then in action in the workplace years later. But I would say, some of the characteristics that make a great mentor are people that are willing to, really challenge your thinking. Obviously, you have to listen, right? If you're not listening, you're not learning. So you have to find the time and the space to do that. Then sort of digest it all and reflect it back to the mentee. And I think it is your job as a great mentor to really challenge that thinking. But I do feel that can work the other way around too, that sort of reverse mentoring concept, right? I think you can have a very fulfilling two-way relationship. And as a mentee, I was always told and encouraged, you have to make sure that the mentor gets something out of this as well, not just watching you be more successful. You've got to try and figure out as well what matters to them in their professional lives and see again where you can help, because there's almost always something if you take the time to really think about it and invest in a solution or two. And I certainly found that the sort of mentoring concept, particularly informally, again, just ended up opening up lots of doors down the road, lots of connections that would later be useful and helpful from a career perspective. But, it's like everything in life, isn't it? You get out what you put in. And often these things can be quite big time commitments initially. And in those early years, you're thinking, oh my goodness, I've got to do this brilliantly. I've got these exams I've got to pass. How can I find the time to network and make all these connections? And I know there's a lot of work that suggests that very kind of formal, sort of, if you like, forced networking has pretty mixed success. And so, there's no doubt that you have to be a little bit more creative around how you build and establish your own personal board of directors.
Absolutely. Sometimes mentors don't necessarily need to be in your industry. I mean, that's my personal view. Sometimes you can be mentored by someone who's not necessarily in your firm or in the exact same industry. Sometimes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, one of my closest friends, but someone who's become a mentor is the person that teaches me how to horse ride, right? And we spend hours together, and, I listen intently and I learn huge amounts. And I would say, obviously a lot of it's around the technical aspects of horse riding and jumping, but there's so much there that then applies to broader life that I take away and that I think about, because obviously, like every sport, at the top end of it, it's incredibly professional and it's amazingly performance focused, and so much more of what goes into that preparation is now mental, not just the physical.
From mentorship to sponsorship, I've recently introduced a new segment in the podcast called React to a Quote. I'll give you a quote and I'd like you to react to it and tell me if you agree, disagree, what it means to you, and elaborate if you feel like it. So this quote is by Carla Harris, who's Vice Chairman of Wealth Management at Morgan Stanley. And this is her quote: "A mentor is nice to have, but you are not going to ascend in any organization without a sponsor."
Yeah, it's a good quote. Yeah, look, I'd agree. You need sponsorship. Again, it doesn't have to be formal. It can be informal. And typically, I suspect the best are the ones that come about naturally. But you definitely need a sponsor. It's like everything in life, right? You need that support network. You need someone there rooting for you, cheering you on. And clearly, a sponsor is even more than that. They're there really advocating for you, really, pressing for that next role for you. and putting in place around you the right building blocks to help you make whatever the next leap is with confidence. So I couldn't agree more that a sponsor is critical. I think, organizations have to constantly think about how they can build in sponsorship to all of their succession pipeline planning, particularly for diverse candidates. It's so, so crucial. And I've seen it so many times that it ends up being kind of make or break for people.
Yeah, totally agree. You've recently joined Citi as their Global Head of Research and Equity Advisory. How are you approaching this new role? Recently, meaning we're towards the end of the year, so
I can't hide behind it. The recent, I won't be able to pretend it's recent for much longer. But in all seriousness, I think it does take a while to learn an organisation and, to establish yourself, to build networks, to build some credibility, to build trust in what you're doing and all those sorts of things. And, often that kind of first 90-day period is very much about you entering an organisation, listening, hearing what people say, both internally and then external stakeholders as well, before you kind of make a plan and, talk about a strategy and what you want to do and what the vision is. And so, I've gone through that perhaps phase of it, which has been hugely exciting. And, I feel there's so much potential and upside. It's really, really exciting because we've got brilliant people, brilliant products, and, got a really great client base externally. Most of my clients, for context, are institutional investors because I sit, as you say, within the research organisation. So getting to work across fixed income and equities. And it's just great fun because you get to talk to really smart people about what's happening in the world and what does that mean and how are things changing and what does that mean for asset prices and what's mispriced. And so for anybody that's intellectually curious, I don't think there's many more rewarding career paths than the one I'm fortunate enough to have been involved with. And when I look at the department that I work with, there's so many people that are incredibly talented who have so many opportunities then that open up as a consequence of all of those things. So I totally understand that investment banking might not be for everybody, and it clearly might not be something that people want to do from 21 till 60. But what it does give you is an amazing training, and it gives you so many great opportunities to then do other things and different things if that's what you wish to do. Sometimes maybe too much choice. I think living in the Western world particularly, we're often spoilt for choice. Once you kind of get on that path and doors do open up, it's remarkable, really. I certainly feel that as someone coming from a kind of small rural town in Middle England, as it were.
Yeah, I can relate to that. Not the small part of England, but as someone who grew up in Ivory Coast.
Yeah, you just I think sometimes you just have to believe in yourself and stick with it long enough, don't you? I often have to pinch myself, to be honest, that I'm still here and I'm still doing this stuff and I still get to see all these really smart people with all these brilliant ideas, both, colleagues and clients. And, like everybody, I think I suffer a lot with imposter syndrome sometimes when you see how wonderfully smart, many people are. And it's amazing, actually, particularly young people today who are obviously far more in tune with technology and have researched things for many, many years. I mean, I don't want to age you or me too much, but we couldn't go on the internet as teenagers and just kind of cruise around learning about the world. And yet, of course, young people today have that. And so whilst there are many aspects of the world that are undoubtedly harder, there are, I think, lots of good things if you look hard and are willing to try and spot them.
No, absolutely. I totally agree with that. Your CEO is Jane Fraser, the first woman to hold the title of CEO at a major top-tier Wall Street bank. As a woman, how do you feel about working at Citi at such a historical time? And how do you think having a woman at the top affects the culture of the bank?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. I feel very proud to work for an organisation that has a female CEO, and I feel very proud that Jane is the first lady of Wall Street. I mean, wow, what a mind blowing achievement! And of course, she's Scottish, so she's from from the United Kingdom, which is even more wonderful. And she's made it on Wall Street, and it just makes you think of the Alicia Keys song: "If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere." You know, it's definitely how I think I would sort of view Wall Street as a Brit, I guess, looking from the outside in. So it's amazingly impressive. And I think, you know, she's obviously relatively new in that seat. She started in, would have been February of this year. So what an interesting time to come in and run such a big and important institution, you know, coming through this crisis. And she's done an amazing job, in my opinion. And I think, you know, the press have also been incredibly supportive, and that's wonderful to see in terms of the tone we've taken around coronavirus. People have recognised that Citi has been one of the banks that has been, you know, really thoughtful around how do you look after your people, how do you bring them back safely, you know, get them vaccinated safely. And I think obviously, rightly, that inspires trust and confidence from all of our people, which is clearly wonderful. And so, you know, it's an exciting time for Wall Street. And I think, you know, it's not just Jane's appointment. You've seen across the industry in the last few years more and more women getting these great jobs. And I do think, you know, as you say, like the world of media as well plays a crucial role in highlighting some appointments across the industry and things that have changed and moved forward. I think the institutional investor community plays a really critical role in pressing companies to think about this in terms of not just their overall board, but then further down, you know, the succession plan, what's the pipeline. You know, everybody plays a role, right? Even us as individuals, we can play a role and we can do things, we can advocate, we can, you know, take part. And it's so important because clearly diversity is one of the most fundamental things in terms of success for the world. And I think, you know, it's no longer the case that you have to build a narrative as to why it matters. But I must say, you know, still something I talk about a lot is the kind of concept of cognitive diversity. It's not just gender, it's not just sexuality, it's not just ethnic background, it's a whole mosaic, right? It's socioeconomic diversity, and it's that willingness and ability to really challenge our own bias. And we've all got a bias, whether conscious or not, and you have to really, I think hard and challenge yourself on those things to help move forward, right? It's only when you can be really open about that and honest that you make real progress.
Absolutely. And just something that I wanted to add about Jane Fraser is that I remember I listened to a podcast that she did, I think it was 2018, a podcast by CNN called Boss Files. And she was telling the story of how she became partner at McKinsey while working part-time, which blew me away because honestly, that's unheard of. I think it's also amazing that someone like her, who's been an advocate for flexible working families, etc., becomes the first lady of Wall Street, as you were saying. I think that's amazing and quite a fantastic message for women across the board.
You know, it's so true, right? I think when I was growing up through business, I can remember thinking, you know, because I knew I personally wanted a family, which of course isn't for everybody, but I knew for me that's what I wanted at some stage. I can remember going and like listening to female leaders and sort of trying to figure out, I wonder if they've got children. Like, I wonder if they've managed to do both, because there was obviously for so many years, so many women had to kind of choose. They had to take one path or the other. I listened to a brilliant podcast actually by Jane Angadia, who is, again, you know, just an amazingly inspirational person. I was lucky enough to sit by her at a dinner years ago, and when she was at Virgin Money, and you know, she's now sort of started up a fintech business, and I was listening to her story on this podcast, and she said that, you know, that's been, you know, something that she's wrestled with. Was she talked about when she started her family, when she had her daughter, and she said that her generation were really, you know, still part of that generation where it felt like you had to choose one thing or another. And I think certainly when I look at my children today, and I've got a daughter and a son, and my daughter's 4. You know, I'm pretty hopeful and confident that she won't have to ever think there's ever got to be a choice, right? And you can see that has really changed a lot in just a couple of generations, which is fantastic.
So, last question. What is your ultimate goal in your career? What's your vision for yourself in the years to come?
I was going to sort of give you a slightly jokey answer and say I'd love to be able to jump around a course of show jumps that are sort of like 1.20 meters in height without knocking one down. But that probably doesn't really count as my career. I'm pretty sure I wouldn't last long if that were my career, that's for sure. I'm not sure there's enough ability there. But look, my professional career, I think my main goals are, to frankly keep really enjoying it. I've been really fortunate that I've been able to take jobs that I felt I would enjoy and not necessarily purely thinking about the forward or the next step, which I know is something at earlier stages of careers where you have to think, oh my goodness, if I do this, does it narrow this option? Does it open that door? And, I think I can remember, for example, leaving research and going into the broader equity business, into a distribution role, into a sales role. I did that because I felt that there were things happening structurally in research that were going to be problematic, and I wasn't sure about the future, and I felt I needed to broaden out my own personal skill set and learn more things. But ultimately, I missed it. I love content, I love ideas, and I love, everything that is at its core. And so it's been so wonderful for me to kind of come full circle and, to my mind, almost come home, and come home having slightly broadened out my perspectives. Because again, I guess it goes back to being a specialist, being a generalist. You kind of need a bit of both, right? You need to find that balance. And I just think, careers aren't linear, so I've got no idea what the future holds in store, really. But I just hope that I'm able to keep doing jobs where I keep learning, keep getting challenged, keep working with really fun, smart people. But the one thing I can say for sure is that life is short, life is very precious, and ultimately you have to do things that make you happy. And I think if you're in a fortunate enough position to have choice and have some options, you kind of owe it to yourself to try and really choose a path that enables you some kind of fulfillment that's broader than just the financial path and being financially secure for you and your family. And I suppose not everybody's going to have that luxury, but I do think that for me, the next stage of my career, I hope that I will keep a really steep learning curve, and I'll be able to keep kind of learning new things. And the nice thing about where I sit today is we're constantly looking at how the world is changing, right? And how technology is changing, at the forefront of so many different trends. And that keeps you on your toes. It makes you realize all the things you don't know, right? So whether it's, flying cars or holograms rather than, appearing physically at meetings, things like the metaverse, there's just so many incredible things, not to mention, clearly the whole, decarbonisation revolution and everything that's linked to that. There's just so many fascinating things around gene therapy and synthetic biology and all these kinds of things. Being able to choose careers and paths that keep you at the forefront of what's going on in the world, I think helps you get up early in the morning with a sort of spring in your step, really.
So heading an organization someday, is that we've got a Scottish lady running an American bank, and we're going to see a lady from Wales.
Yeah, from the Welsh borders. I would love to. I'd love to really run a business, run an organisation one day. I think there's no greater honour than have the chance to do that and to take a firm forward. It doesn't have to be public, can be private companies, can be a startup. Who knows? But I think there's obviously a lot of us that have that kind of itch, to scratch at some stage.
Sky's the limit. Thank you so much, Lucy. I wish you much success at Citi and in your life as a whole. It was a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And as ever, it's an absolute pleasure talking to you. So thank you very much, and wishing you and your family all the best too.
Thank you. Thank you to Lucy Baldwin for being so generous and open in this conversation about her journey. I absolutely loved what she shared about mentoring, sponsorship, building your personal board of directors, my personal favorite, and the importance of keeping excitement alive in your careers. Keep supporting Entre-Elles and make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. See you in 2 weeks for a new episode in French. Bye!